It's a pleasure to introduce General John B. Sylvester. He will share with us his distinguished military service in the Persian Gulf War. He is remembered for his command of the famous Tiger Brigade of the 2nd Armored Division. His remarkable story will help us better understand the challenges they faced. Today, we will join him in thanking him for his military service with distinction in the First Gulf War. He has been awarded the Meritorious Service Medal, the Defense Superior Service Medal, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Silver Star. He is a graduate of Texas A&M University and United States Army War College. General Sylvester is now retired from the United States Army. Please join me in welcoming General John B. Sylvester.
All right. First, you want to know about the Persian Gulf War or the Gulf War or whatever y'all call it. Desert Storm, I guess, is the name that's been given to it. But let me give you a little background first, and I'll put something up there so you can look at it. 29 years ago today, we were 4 days from kicking off the first, what we thought was going to be major combat in many years. At least in my case, it had been 20 years since I came back from Vietnam, and there we were in the middle of the desert getting ready to go, and I will tell you the pucker factor was quite a bit higher than when your algebra teacher announces a pop quiz in 10 minutes, take out your pencils. But it was a pretty high pucker factor. But now let me back up 30 years and set the stage, because on the 2nd of August of 1990, a guy by the name of Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Well, I was training in command of my brigade. A brigade is about 6,000 folks, and we were getting ready to go to the National Training Center at California, which to a soldier in those days was the biggest deal you could possibly do. You took your brigade, you deployed out to this place called the National Training Center out in the middle of California desert, not far from Death Valley, and you pitted yourself against an adversary, a trained opposing force, and all of your equipment had lasers on it and all this other stuff. It was like laser tag, only with about 15,000 guys out in the middle of the desert battling it out with one another, and they had all this stuff on computers, and they could stop the battle at any time and show you where you screwed up and what you had to do to get better and all of that. And it was a major pucker factor in everybody's life when you were getting ready to go to the National Training Center. Little did I know what the pucker factor was going to be a little later. But on the 2nd of August, I get a radio call. And a radio call says, Tiger 6, this is whatever they were called. I can't remember the call sign anymore on the radio. It said, you need to return to the Operations Center, time now. And I said, why? And they said, because Saddam Hussein just invaded Kuwait. Well, I won't tell you what my exact response was, but it was kind of close to who's Saddam Hussein and where the heck is Kuwait, because I honestly didn't have a clue in my head at the time. So I drove back to the Tactical Operations Center, which is this bunch of tents and camouflage stuff and track vehicles set up in the middle of Fort Hood where our command center was. And when I walked into that place, the atmosphere was electric. Where we had had maps of Fort Hood and the National Training Center and all that stuff up on the wall, all of a sudden there were maps of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Iraq and all of that stuff. And where they had come up with these maps, I have no clue. But they were already putting up what we call order of battle, what the enemy situation looked like. And I will tell you, if you never had the little chills that go up the crack of your you-know-what, I started having them right there. Because it dawned on me that we weren't going to the National Training Center to play war. We were going to go to war. I tell you what, that's an experience if you've never been through it. And I hope that y'all never have to go through it, but you may have to in some day. That day, that notification, and on the 19th of September, that's a little over a month later, we started shipping our first troops. We had moved over 3,000 pieces of equipment to the ports at Beaumont and Houston that had been loaded on ships, and we started putting troops on airplanes to fly over to Saudi Arabia to meet at the port as the ship came in and unload that stuff. And on, I can't remember, the something of October, my wife is sitting right over there, kissed my wife and daughter goodbye, and we left in the middle of the night to fly over there and start this thing that you're seeing up here right now. And it was amazing. All 3,000 pieces of equipment had to be painted. We were painted in what was called woodland camouflage to go fight in Europe because that's where we were scheduled to go fight if we ever had to fight. And we had to paint everything desert tan. And we had to get all of the troops ready. We had to write wills for everybody, do all a million things that you have to do to get ready to take 6,000 men and women off to combat 10,000 miles away, and it was one heck of a chore. It was probably 18, 19, 20-hour days, 7 days a week, no time off except for a soldier to go get his family straight for 1 or 2 days, and that was it. The rest of the time we were working, getting ready to deploy, and it was incredible. But let me back up just a minute. I want to put this next chart up there. When a nation is somehow or other its national interests are threatened by some actor, by some action by a foreign actor, there's 4 things that you can do about it as a country. The first thing is you can attempt to persuade the bad actors through diplomacy, both directly with them and with lots of other people, to influence them that that's not a good idea, that you go invade your neighbor and start killing all their people and stealing their oil and doing all that other stuff, which is what Saddam Hussein had done when he went into Kuwait. I mean, the Kuwaiti people basically fled. They stole everything they could possibly steal. They went into, if you were, and your parents were kids in those days, so your grandparents will probably remember that there were pictures on the news of these guys going into hospitals and stealing incubators and blah, 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 doing all kinds of terrible stuff. But you can influence them through diplomacy or political maneuvering. You can also influence them through economics. You can do embargoes and all that kind of stuff on them. But when a bad actor has gone and done something like this, it's a little late to start putting embargoes and economic sanctions and all of that stuff on them. The third way that you can try to influence them is what we call psychosocial. It's through the media and through information, convincing them through the information war, if you will, that what they're doing isn't good. The last thing that you can do is you put military force on the ground. And that's always the last thing that you can do, at least from a soldier's perspective, is put boots on the ground. But that's the decision that was made, but it was made after a long process. Up here on the screen, you can see the president. Obviously, this place is named for the president, George Herbert Walker Bush, and all of his war staff out here, General Powell, General Schwarzkopf, National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft. You can see him up here talking to one of the most influential senators at the time. You can see him down here with his immediate cabinet folks, and that's Margaret Thatcher, who's the Prime Minister of England. So, they're building a coalition to decide what to do about Saddam Hussein. And now they're working, they've got a UN resolution, they've got 35,000 people involved, and there's the decision made to move about 700,000 soldiers over there. So back to our little piece, we have moved 6,318 soldiers from what was called the Tiger Brigade Combat Team, short the Tiger Brigade, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And that's a little bitty part of that whole big operation was the 6,318, and you always remember that number because they're guys that work for you out there. And here is a picture of, actually, that looks very impressive, at least it does to me, but we had just been called out into the middle of this area in the desert, and Secretary Baker had showed up and he had addressed the troops. And this was us walking away, and I didn't find this picture, somebody else did, but just coincidentally, that's me right there, standing looking cool in the middle of 140 degrees and dust and blah, blah, blah. But this was early on. That picture was probably taken in November or early December. The next big hitch in my giddy-up was we had deployed our brigade that was part of the 2nd Armored Division with the 1st Cavalry Division. A brigade is 6,000 people, a division's about 15 to 20,000 people, and the 1st Cavalry Division was at Fort Hood. 2nd Armored Division was also at Fort Hood, but it was about to stand down, and my brigade was the last part of the division that had not yet stood down. We were getting ready to go to the National Training Center and then go away. But I got attached initially to the 1st Cavalry Division to deploy. So already I'm with folks that I really don't know all that well, although personally I knew a couple of my compatriot brigade commanders, and I had known the division commander from the past. The pyramid of rank gets smaller as you go toward the top, so as a colonel, I knew quite a few folks back in those days, and I happened to know them, but I had not worked with them. I had not trained with them. I had trained with my brigade. We had trained very hard. I knew my subordinate commanders very well, but I didn't know the rest of them. But I deployed with the 1st Cavalry Division. Well, very shortly after this picture was taken, I was told that there had been a major change in the construct of the force for the war. There was going to be a requirement to move a tank brigade, a tank-heavy brigade, which is what my brigade was. We had 122 M1A1 tanks, 86 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, and we were composed of what we called 4 different maneuver or fighting battalions and then 5 different supporting battalions worth of troops. So that 6,000 troops, we were going to be moved from under Army control to Marine control. I was going to go to work, and our brigade was going to go to work as part of a Marine, United States Marine Corps force. And I know Malik, wherever you are now, told me he might have an aspiration to join the Marines someday and be in a Marine band like his granddad. But all of a sudden, I wasn't with the Marine band. I was with the Marine Corps, and that was altogether foreign to me as a commander and made very difficult. But in fact, these are some pictures right here of some Marines. That's a ragtag looking bunch over there. I don't like that picture at all, but Shirley found it somewhere. And these guys are all out of uniform and stuff, and that ain't cool. But this is the information on Desert Storm. You see that it lasted 43 days. Well, 39 days of that was air campaign, and 4 days of it was a ground fight. And during that 4 days of the ground fight, there were over 50,000 prisoners captured. My brigade, we captured 4,000 prisoners. And then, because when you capture a prisoner, you've obviously got an obligation to feed them and water them and house them and do all that other stuff. We couldn't handle that. We just told them walk south. We gave them food and water, and we kept going north because for 4 days we were in constant combat. And during that constant combat period, Tiger Brigade lost 2 soldiers and had 19 soldiers wounded. There's 2 names. When you go over to the library today, when you go through the little room that has the model tank in it and all that, and you go into the next room, there's a big door, and to the right there is a plaque with a lot of names on it. I think there are 150 some odd names, which was fortunately all we lost, but regrettably the soldiers that we lost during that war, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that we lost during that war. Go in there and look at that wall. There's 2 names I want you to look for. There's a name, William Palmer, Spec 4, United States Army military police officer, and Harold Witzke, Sergeant First Class, a tanker, a cavalryman, and one of my great soldiers. Just look at those 2 names and understand that the cost of war, even though this one is described as a small war, 4 days, blah, 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 the cost of war is heavy. This shows some of the equipment, tells you about 700,000 troops. Again, these are Marines. That's a Marine artillery piece being fired. This is after the war when we've got some captured Iraqi stuff. Now, this map here shows the battle plan after the fight occurred. That little symbol right there is the Tiger Brigade symbol. That's the outfit I commanded. Actually, this map is a bit wrong because that symbol belongs there and that symbol belongs there because my brigade went up through this flank up here and ended up right there where that thing is. There are a couple of other guys here in Aggie land that one of them commanded a brigade here and one of them was the chief of staff of that operation there. And then there's a whole bunch more, but this is the map that shows this thing that was called the Great Left Hook. Understanding what this is all about, initially, the plan was we were going to have a much smaller force and we were going to just attack into Kuwait and we were going to clear Kuwait out and push the Iraqis out to the north back up into Iraq. Then the decision was made that there would be a need for a much larger force. In those days, it was generally understood that chemical warfare would be used for the first time since the First World War, and I mean used by the adversary. We believed that Saddam Hussein was going to use sarin, nerve gas, and all that stuff on us. So when we went into this fight, we were in what was called MOP 4. We were wearing all our chemical protective stuff and all of that, and when we were training in that, it was incredible because temperatures were 120, 130 degrees, and we're wearing full uniforms, flak jackets, mop gear, all this other stuff. But as it turned out, and I was telling somebody the other day, it rained and then snowed on us during the actual combat operation, so at least it was a bit cooler. But we expected in this war to have just an incredible time going against a foe who was going to use chemical warfare for the first time in modern history, or at least since World War I when they used it in the trenches. So the pucker factor I talked about earlier was a bit higher. And 29 years ago, 4 days from now, when we actually attacked, I will tell you that there were high emotions out there in that desert. We used a bunch of new weapons new at that time weapons during that conflict. One of them was this Patriot missile, which was an anti-missile missile called the Scud Buster. The Scud was a ground-to-ground ballistic missile that the Iraqis had that was made by the Russians, etc. But this thing managed to shoot down the great majority of those. Regrettably, there was one that they didn't shoot down that killed 19 American soldiers in Saudi Arabia. Got to give the Air Force their due, especially in my friend Charles, United States Air Force Colonel over here, is sitting there. The Air Force, of course, and the Navy Air and Marine Air conducted the first 39 days of the air campaign. And we used to lay there at night, and you can see a long ways out in that desert. You put these night observation goggles on, and you can see incredibly well, especially lights and whatnot. And we used to watch the airplanes come up 100 miles south of us and come up and go to big circles and as they went on to the aerial refuelers. And then you'd watch them go over into Iraq. Their visible lights would go out, but you could still see the lights, the different kind of light with your night vision goggles, and go into the north and do their bombing campaign and all that to prepare for the ground war that would follow if there was not a capitulation by Saddam Hussein, and there wasn't. He was arrogant to the end. This was also the first use of this thing right here, the Apache helicopter back in those days. The Apache helicopter's a small world thing. The guy who commanded this outfit is a very good friend of mine now and works together with me on behalf of combat wounded soldiers. And they went in on the very first raid and took out all of the Iraqi close-in air defense radar stuff so that the Air Force could then launch this thing right here, which was the first stealth fighter, the F-117. And small world aspect again, the guy who commanded that squadron is a good friend. Now, this starts to show this. Saddam Hussein not only invaded this country, when he realized that he was going to be ejected from that country, he made the decision to destroy it completely, destroy the oil industry, destroy everything. He set every single oil well, every single chemical or petrochemical plant, everything on fire. And when we attacked into the middle of that stuff, I mean, it was like going into Dante's Inferno. It was absolutely incredible because you flat can't see. Now, we had the benefit of thermal sights, and with thermal sights you can differentiate equipment and whatnot, even in the midst of all of those fires. But you flat couldn't see with your eyeballs. I'm going to show you another picture in a minute that says it's at night, but it isn't. It's broad daylight. But this was incredible, the decision made by a head of state to go into another country and destroy all of its infrastructure. But that's exactly what they did. In the end, they were routed, obviously, by us. This is just a picture of, it happens to be a Kuwaiti helicopter. The Kuwaiti military left except for one brigade, which was reconstituted out of the country and brought back in. This picture right here says it's a soldier standing night guard. It's not. That's in the middle of the day. I came home from that conflict and I coughed up black crap for a year and a half that I had ingested out there. I mean, it was just, this stuff was thick, black, nasty all the time. Look at the toll of destruction down there, and you can see that's roiling black smoke. So that's not grass burning, that's oil, and oil well blowing up over there, etc. This is Kuwait City. This is Bubiyan Island. My brigade attacked right up through here, and we ended up right there, right underneath that huge plume. And we stayed right there on that spot for 4 months before we were allowed to move back down and get ready to come home. But you look at the crap in the water and the crap in the air, and that was the most environmentally damaging thing that had happened in a long, long time. From this part of the country comes Red Adair, who in those days was a major oil well fire putter-outer guy, along with another company called Boots and Coots. They're from the Houston area. It was said that they couldn't get those fires out inside of several years. I think they put them all out inside of 6 months. It's just an incredible act of saving this whole apparatus. And it took them a long time to rebuild all the oil fields, but they got the fires out in about 6 months. Another picture of the devastation of the fire in the background, and some of the 50,000 Iraqi soldiers who were taken prisoner and ultimately returned home. The Navy got involved the first time in my modern military life. Back in Vietnam, they fired naval gunfire support of us, and I didn't care for it because they generally didn't hit what I wanted them to hit, and they often hit around us, and that wasn't cool. But they did a pretty good job here, only they only fired over near the coast that they could reach and never got as far inland as I was. The most important thing that they did was logistically. When my brigade was attached to the Marine Corps, I met with a Marine three-star general who was commanding the whole thing. And he said, "What's your biggest threat, Colonel?" I said, "My biggest threat is not having gas enough to be able to move my tanks." He said, "How much gas do you need?" I said, "We burn 253,700 gallons of jet fuel every 8 hours." He said, "That's impossible." I said, "No, sir, it's not. That's what I burn." I said, "I've got trucks that carry 253,000, and I've got 253,000 in my tank at the beginning of an 8-hour period. At the end of that 8 hours, I start pumping out of those trucks. When I start pumping out of those trucks, I need another 253,700 gallons of fuel moving to me." He turned to his Marine Corps deputy for logistics and he said, "Well, how much fuel we got there, Chuck?" And Chuck said, "Sir, we carry 36,000 gallons of fuel." And so I said, "General, my biggest challenge is fuel." The Navy built a fuel transfer point out in the Gulf, put I can't remember what they call them, but pipelines that went into the shore that came into a big fuel farm they built, and they put 3 million gallons of fuel on the ground behind my brigade to keep us moving. The Marines are essentially foot soldier. The Army is essentially a mounted force, and we had all those tanks and all that stuff, so our Achilles heel was fuel. But the Navy fixed it. This is an interesting picture. That's a B-52 bomber. It's still in existence today. In fact, there's an Aggie that we all know that flew these things for years and years and years. That airplane was originally fielded in the late 1950s, actually mid-1950s, and it's still in service today. I told you about watching the fighters and the bombers and all that stuff come up in the middle of the night. These guys got to where they would go in the daytime, and you could sit there and watch them. Watch a flight of 3 go and turn, and they're up at 40,000 feet, so you're watching them, and then they turn, and about the time they get back level with you, you can feel the earth start to shake from the munitions that they dropped, because they dropped a phenomenal number of bombs to soften up the enemy as we attacked. But when you get down to it, it's the boots on the ground. It's the young guys like this. This particular guy happens to be a young Marine firing a mortar, and at the end of the day, it's the individual soldier and Marine that causes things to happen on any battlefield. But there's the guys at the top. This is General Schwarzkopf again. He's getting a sword from the Bahraini defense minister, one of our allies, and one of the guys, coincidentally, that was very worried about Saddam Hussein, not just going into Kuwait, but going on to Bahrain and all the rest of them, Saudi Arabia, etc., and taking over.
Okay. So you'd mentioned this huge international coalition that formed to address this conflict. And you also, on the first slide, it says something about Saudi Arabia and Egypt asking Western countries to intervene. Could you just sort of explain why all these powerful Western nations took an interest in the conflict that was happening in Kuwait?
Because of the fear I talked about a minute ago that Saddam Hussein wouldn't just go into Kuwait. He would then come into Saudi Arabia, and he would go to Bahrain, and he would go to all of these, that his aspiration was to take over. And it was such a horrendous act when he attacked into Kuwait. Certainly all of the regional partners down there, Egypt and Saudi Arabia and blah, 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 all said, wait a minute, we got to put a stop to this. And then, of course, the U.S.'s natural partners of the U.K. and France and Germany and blah, 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 all got interested as well in solving this previously, certainly not unheard of, but unheard of since Hitler invaded all of Europe back at the end of the 30s and into the early 40s.
So I understand the regional interest in the conflict. What caused countries as far away as us and as Britain and as France to get involved?
That's probably a pretty complicated issue of why countries act. I mean, having commanded in the Balkans later on in my career, there were 37 nations involved that had troops there. And as the commanding general of that force, I had to convince the troops involved and hence their nations, because no nation directs its troops into harm's way, that it isn't in the interest of that nation. So national interest causes nations to get involved. One of the countries that's actually not highlighted on that map I showed you is Japan. Well, Japan didn't send forces, but Japan sent one heck of a lot of trucks, these little Hilux Toyota trucks over. And they did that because, to be very honest, I think the threat to the world's oil industry caused the majority of the other nations not directly involved to intervene. So I think it's probably oil is the answer.
So what was your most memorable experience during this war?
Memorable in a good way was when a soldier told me after it was all over with, "Gee, sir, I'm glad we trained as hard as we trained, because this was actually easier than going to the National Training Center." That was the good experience, the good memory. The bad one, I asked you to go read about when you get over here and you see these young kids writing letters to family, to parents, to tell them that we have lost their youngster. That's the toughest thing in the world to do.
All right, so this is not really a question. I just want to tell you thank you for serving our country.
Thank you. And when you graduate from high school next year, if you want to join us, I'll come sign you up. But you got to graduate first. I had a youngster yesterday tried to get me to sign him up yesterday, and I said, nope, get that high school diploma. But thank you very much. It was a great 37 years of service.
You talked about some of the environmental impacts of this conflict. Do you know of anything that was directly developed after this conflict to kind of ameliorate any problems that might happen in the future that are similar to this?
That's a great question. I've already described the low-level environmental impact. Low-level environmental impact on people was absolutely incredible to the people of that region, to the flora and fauna of that region, to the waters of the Gulf and all of that. It's a long process to get oil out of anything, whether you're talking about washing it out of a bird or you're talking about it impact on flora, etc. The longer term impacts of that operation, I'm not in a position to be able to say. I don't know. I know that the impact on people was incredible. I don't think that the forecasted massive worldwide environmental impacts were as high as they were originally declared to possibly become. I don't think it was. But I don't know. I'm really not equipped to go into other than the effects on us on the ground. And I will tell you that environment was absolutely incredible to try to operate in.
Howdy, you said you were awarded the bronze or 2 Bronze Stars and a Silver Star. And
Yes,
I know
sir.
the Silver Star is very hard to achieve as a military accomplishment. How were you awarded the Silver Star?
At one point in the battle, we had 2 tank battalions that were attacking parallel to one another. And the right-hand battalion of the 2 battalions had its scouts, its reconnaissance out front of it. That reconnaissance element, understanding there are no terrain features in the desert to navigate on, nothing. You've got a map, you've got cardinal directions, and you know at some point you're going to run into the enemy because we know he's there. So you're moving on an azimuth. Let's just say you're moving straight north. They were moving straight north, but somehow or other, and we had early versions of GPS. They were called sluggers back in those days. But there were 2 45-minute periods each day when the satellites, there were insufficient satellites to make the GPS work. You know, the GPS works by shooting off the satellites and getting a triangulation and showing you where you are. Today, everybody's got one in your car. It'll tell you, you know, that you're sitting in your driveway at your house. Back in those days, if you had 3 satellites available, it was a miracle. And there were 2 periods when there were no satellites available and there was no navigation. The first one of those periods is earlier than this, and I'll get back to your question. I had a military police jeep leading my combat trains, which are our immediate logistical element, leading them through the minefields that we breached. The minefields sitting at an angle, and they came through that, and then they turned when they weren't supposed to turn because their GPS, their slugger wasn't working, and they went into the back end of the minefield, and that's when William Palmer lost his life. The second episode now, further north, is these 2 battalions moving, and in this particular case, I got a scout platoon or a reconnaissance element that starts moving laterally across in front of the other battalion. We were in the middle of a very, very heavy fight at the time, and the radios were going nuts. I couldn't get a hold of my subordinate commander on my own command frequency. I couldn't get him on his frequency because he was in the middle of a very, very heavy fight. And so I drove my tracked vehicle right up next to his tank, and I was trying to jump off to talk to him because I had been listening to these reports and I had seen the movement of this scout platoon, and I could see what was happening. And 10 minutes before, there had been a tremendous fight of this battalion on the right, and they had reported that there had been a number of enemy T-72 tanks that had moved across their front, and they destroyed them. This battalion is listening to those same reports, and they see these vehicles out in front of them coming, and they think that they're enemy vehicles. For whatever reason, some magic, I recognized that's what was going on. And bottom line was, I got over there and I stopped the attack of these friendly vehicles, and so saved 6 crews worth of vehicles from being annihilated by friendly fire. And that's why I was awarded the Silver Star.
What did you do with the prisoners that you didn't send away?
With prisoners?
Yes.
Yeah, prisoners are ultimately put into a holding area of some kind, and out there it was just barbed wire, and you put them into that holding area and you give them what you can to make them comfortable. Food and water, most essentially, and some form of protection if you can, blankets and those kind of things, because many of those guys, they came out of their foxholes and stuff, and the only thing white they've got to wave is their underwear. So, I mean, there were actually guys out there walking around almost with no clothes on, just trying to give up to save their lives. We have a responsibility to take care of prisoners, and take care of them, meaning to safeguard them, feed them, and water them.
Like, what type of food did y'all eat?
What kind of food did we eat?
Yeah.
Okay, I knew there had to be some chow hound out there. Want to know about chow. You know, growing up in the Army, and I was an Army brat. My dad was in the Army, Second World War and all of that. And so, and then I joined the Army at 22 myself. And during the time I was in the Army, starting in Vietnam, we actually were still eating old K rations, which were a World War II canned and boxed ration. By the time we got to the Gulf War, we were eating these things called T rations. They were these huge tins of rations, and you put them into a kind of a burner unit. It was a steam oven, really, that steamed them. And when we were able to have those were actually called A rations. I tried to make it a point that my soldiers got 1 hot meal every day. I tried to get them all to have 2 hot meals, morning and evening. And in the morning, we had created this thing called bullets and sliders. It was 2 thermos bottles full of coffee and 2 packages for each soldier of ham, cheese, and egg sandwich. So, wrapped in tinfoil. And when you got your fuel, you got your 2 sandwiches and a thermos of coffee. But most of the time, and especially during the actual combat period, we were eating what was called MREs, meals ready to eat, and euphemistically called meals rejected by everyone. But it was a ration that was freeze-dried, and you had to open it up, and then it would absorb air and whatnot, and it would turn into something you could actually eat, and they were pretty good. But I will tell you, nowadays, they have advanced those things where you got chicken stroganoff and all kinds of great stuff with your field rations. But the effort was always made to try to feed your soldier an A ration being, good, hot food. So it was everything from MREs to ARATs. Want to follow up? Dessert. Yeah. Back in the Vietnam days, we had these little cans of peaches. And you always tried to get the peaches because there would be one can of peaches in a whole case of C rations. But you weren't usually that lucky. Most of the time, you had these little bitty tins of grape jelly, and you had these dried out crackers, and you'd take one of these dried out crackers and you'd put that grape jelly on top, and that was dessert.
You mentioned how Saddam Hussein tried to basically destroy all of Kuwait's infrastructure. What do you think was Saddam Hussein's main reason for trying to destroy Kuwait's infrastructure and economy and basically leave the country in ruins?
Why was he trying to do that?
Yes.
I never did understand his motive, other than at that particular point, he probably understood that everything was lost. So if he could kill the oil supply to the hated West, then he would have succeeded in a major feat in the eyes of those who thought he was a brilliant leader. That's the only motive I can ascribe to why he would do that. It was the act of a petulant child throwing down the doll and breaking it after you make them do their homework or whatever.
What motivated you to join?
What motivated me to join the Army? I told you the last time I wore this uniform was 55 years ago. It was 55 years ago because I was actually beginning of my junior year in the Corps here at Texas A&M. I was called to go see the commandant at the time, who was a Colonel Denzel Baker. Colonel Baker looked at me and he said, "Son, you're not exactly an academic stalwart, are you?" And I allowed as how I would probably rather go to what was Eastgate in those days and drink a beer than I would study. And it was my fault. I was not an academic stalwart. My grades were horrible. There was a 3-point system in those days, and I think I had about a 1.1. And in order to get a contract with the Corps to go into the Army, you had to have at least a 1.5 GPR. And that colonel had told me, "I'll give you 1 semester to get your grades to a 1.5. Well, I worked my butt off and I got them to a 1.38. And he said, "Son, I gave you a target of 1.5, not 1.38. He said, "You're not cut out to be an Army officer." And so I took that lesson to heart, mainly because I had disappointed my dad. My dad, I told you, was a World War II guy, infantry company commander, wounded twice in battle and blah, blah, blah. And Vietnam was going on. And I thought that if your nation was at war, what you did as a young man was you signed up to go. And I was told, "Son, you ain't going to make it as an Army officer." So 18 days after graduation, I enlisted in the Army as a private. And I enlisted because I wanted to serve, and I wanted to show my dad that I could be what he was. And so that's why I served. And you'll ask soldiers today, "Why do you enlist?" And they'll tell you, "I enlist for the college bonus. I enlist to serve my country. I enlist because my buddy next door did. I enlist for this, that, and the other." There's all kinds of reasons why you join the military. Money. I mean, it don't pay great. My base pay when I joined was $86.50 a month. So it wasn't the money, but it was the sense of service that I felt and that I had. I wanted to serve my country. You ask a soldier when he gets ready to get out, "Why did you serve?" He's probably not going to tell you any of those things about money or college or any of that other crap. He's going to say, "I served for this guy, and I served for this guy. I served for my buddies," the battle buddy, the buddy system. You serve for the honor of serving together with fellow American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And I kept it up for all of those years. Obviously, I advanced in rank through the grace of a lot of people who helped me grow and whatnot in the business as life went on. And I discovered that I could actually do it. I could make it as an Army officer. I regret that Colonel Baker did not live to the point where I could go up to him and everybody says, "I guess you'd go show him." No, I would go thank him for being a wake-up call and an influence in my life that said, if you work hard for what you want, you can get there. I don't care who you are in America, and I believe that today. If you work hard, you apply yourself, you do whatever it is that you can do the best way you can possibly do it, you will succeed. And I firmly do believe that. So I hope you all do too. No recruiting pitch here that says the Army will help you get there any better than anywhere else will. But, oh, by the way, that's a great opportunity to serve should you desire to do it. And any one of y'all next year after you graduate want to come to me and get some help about all that, I'll be happy to do that. Now there's a question back here.
What are some things you think you could have done differently?
What would I have done differently in my whole life?
Yeah, like you.
Yeah, I would have studied harder while I was here at Aggieland, and I would have got commissioned along with my classmates instead of being kind of branded a dummy. And I wasn't a dummy. I was just lazy. I thought it was more fun to screw off than it was work, and that's just not the way it is. You know, I've got two grandsons right now. One of them's great in school, does all this other stuff. The other one could care less. You know, it's not important. Well, it is important. It's important to establishing a baseline about yourself, and oh, by the way, learning stuff. A little tactical lesson in all of that. I hated math in school. I couldn't understand why we would study algebra and trigonometry and calculus and geometry and all that stuff. It just didn't get to me. And then I went to the Field Artillery Officer Advanced course. I had to learn to shoot artillery pieces, and in those days we didn't have computers. We had a slide rule. Any of y'all know who knows what a slide rule is in this class? Like 2 hands. It's this little stick thing that you move back and forth. You do all your calculations on. I didn't even know what one was. And all of a sudden I've got to be able to use it. I've got to understand trigonometry. I couldn't understand AB, AC, blah, 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 all that stuff. I didn't get it. I was using all of these tables and I didn't understand any of it. So I wished I had applied myself better in school is the one thing that I wished I had done better. Thanks for the opportunity to come in here and talk to you all today first. And tell you a little bit about the Gulf War and the history of all of that. But more importantly, just to look out at all of you faces and see the future of America, because y'all are in high schools across this nation. You all are the future of our country. So get a good education, apply yourself, do whatever you're going to do, play band, play sports, do all that other good stuff, work a little bit at what you do, and then find your way. And oh, by the way, you're not going to find your way the day you graduate from here or even the day you graduate from A&M unless you're somebody like Miss Allie sitting back there. And but you got a great future ahead of you, but it's what you do about your future, not what somebody else does. All about y'all, each of you individually. But then as you grow, you become part of some kind of a team. And I was fortunate to grow into a brotherhood. The brotherhood was the United States Army, and it was incredible. And I thank God for that opportunity, and I thank those who allowed me to do that, and I thank you all for allowing me to be here this morning. Thank you.